Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome everyone to our e-webinar on managing records and information for transparent and accountable and inclusive governance in the digital era. I'm Victoria Lemieux, Senior Public Sector Specialist with the World Bank, and I'm very delighted to have with me here today Dr. Anne Thurston, who will be presenting our case studies on the Nordic countries. Anne, welcome. I'd just like to introduce her. Anne is someone who is known globally as a pioneer for over 3 decades in the field of records and information management. She's worked in so many different countries around the world to provide practical solutions for records management. And she, in 1989, established the International Records Management Trust, which is an organization that has worked tirelessly to help countries all around the world improve their records management. And in 2000, for all of her efforts, she was awarded the Order of the British Empire for services to public administration in Africa. And she's also received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the UK Records Management Society in 2006, and many, many lifetime achievements for her contributions to records management all around the world. And she continues to do that in her efforts supporting and working with the bank to bring this knowledge, to share her knowledge on records management and the knowledge from the Nordic countries on managing digital records, which is increasingly a huge challenge for countries all around the world. Various of you will be at different stages of introducing digital forms of recorded communication, but in most countries, today there is some form of using email, texting, financial management systems, personnel management systems. There's some level of digitization, and it's growing. And so what Anne is here to talk about today is how can we get on top of the challenges of managing this growing explosion of digital records. So Anne, over to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Vicky, thank you. What a pleasure. I have for a long time felt that the Nordic countries are introducing innovations and tackling these issues that you're mentioning in a very creative way. And so it's been a huge pleasure to me to be able to learn more in depth from them in working on these case studies. And I really want to begin by saying the Nordic officials with whom I've been working, the professionals, the ministry, stakeholders have just been outstanding. But of course, any mistake is mine, not theirs. And I'm just thankful to them for their generosity and their willingness to share their lessons. So what we're really doing is looking at something in a new way, not just looking at managing records and information, but looking at how the management of that information intersects with openness and digital governance, which are worldwide aspirations now. And I think that there's a lot that we can learn just by even studying international standards. But really, when we see it in practice and we see the challenges that they're experiencing, we have something, I think, really to talk about. So what I'm focusing on in this talk is the countries Norway, Finland, and Estonia. Now, Estonia can be called a Baltic country or it can be called a Nordic country, but increasingly I see it listed as a Nordic country. I know it's both, but as it collaborates with Finland to develop new solutions, the ties to the Nordic countries are quite strong. Really, the foundation of my thinking is that when we look at international goals for openness and accountable and inclusive government, we often see that there's an assumption there that information is available, we can trust it, we can share it reliably. But in my experience, many countries don't yet have that solid evidence base and the underpinning legal and regulatory framework that is needed to make this information available as a real solid evidence base, a platform for beginning to move forward in the digital environment. So my purpose in presenting this information is to look at, yes, international standards can fill the gaps where the gaps are there, but if we want to really understand the value of accurate, records and data for openness and digital governance, I think we can look carefully at what these really amazing countries are doing, just to see what's involved, what are the benefits, what are the risks if we don't manage this resource, what are the challenges, and what needs to change, because a whole new vision is being formulated. So why we chose these three countries to look at are because the three of them place a very high value on openness. They see it as a strong social value on promoting social rights. They're very committed to using technology to provide high quality services and to care for vulnerable groups in society. And they're committed to using information as an essential resource for national development. They all share a strong focus on what they call whole of government strategy steering, on maximizing opportunities for digital government. And they emphasize interoperability solutions. They see one of the challenges as siloed institutional arrangements and fragmented institutions, so that there's a duplication, a waste of effort, and information systems that aren't operable. And so really the aim is to get everything working together so that government capacity can be integrated, you can get your maximum value from your information resources, especially when they're used for policy making or setting strategies or long-term planning. The Nordic approach emphasizes evidence-based decision-making and policy, and the experience is increasingly that the higher the quality of information, the more meaningful it is for formulating policies and outcomes for society that are really going to make a difference. They use different approaches, but they all, when they're managing their digital records and data, they apply standards, and they use the whole process to define processes and responsibilities. So they manage records well, and they see data as something that's extremely valuable, but to be useful to the state, it must be of a high quality. Wanted to start with Estonia, and in each case, I've just used a couple of words to characterize what I think is so outstanding about these societies. So Estonia's commitment to information governance and the information society are, to me, very impressive. Looking quickly at the national context, Estonia is, as we saw on the map, a small country positioned between Europe and Russia. They have experienced wave after wave of occupiers, and they were annexed in 1940, and brief interruption during the war when Germany took over, but the annexation by the Soviet Union lasted till 1991. And I think Estonia has developed, through all of this, a very adaptable culture, deeply committed to freedom, self-determination, preserving their national identity. So as soon as Estonia got independence, they started using technology to support democracy, services to citizens, and sustainable economic growth. When they got their independence, or their re-independence in 1991, they had very little IT infrastructure and not very many resources for large-scale IT development. But they developed a skill base quite quickly, and they used their great intelligence and innovation to develop and invest in core systems, keeping their costs low, and coming up with some very, very innovative solutions. So the values of innovation, openness, transparency, which are so deeply rooted in their culture, are expressed in their concept that public sector information should be available to the public without the public even having to ask for it. So it is, the very freedom of information is certainly important, but it goes even deeper, I think, with them to say, this is a right of our culture. Alongside their focus on information technology, they recognize the need to manage digital information as the evidence base for the high standard of service delivery. And their approach is to apply internationally agreed professional principles to any information, whether it's paper-based, whether it's a database, whether it's system-generated records. They link information governance to quality service provision and transparency. Now, interoperability, as I've mentioned, is a cornerstone for Estonia's technological development. Since the 1990s, they've been working toward interoperability. There are rules for this. Most public records in Estonia are created and exchanged electronically. And once they've gathered this information, they make every effort to reuse it and make it available to citizens. So they're working toward a common logical approach to data, records, and technological systems. Estonian citizens have benefited hugely from this. They have been using online services for a decade. They, for instance, most Estonians, 98%, do online tax declarations. The medical services can access a patient's record wherever the patient is seen as long as there's consent. And business, of course, draws heavily on this. What's interesting is all three of these countries, we have a strong legal framework that guarantees citizens the right to information. Estonian constitution guarantees this. It makes authorities legally responsible for providing information to citizens. And it's only where there is a real reason, legal reason to withhold information that it might not be available. But this is really a core part of their way of operating. They passed a Public Information Act in 2000 in order to underpin democracy, the social rule of law, open society, and it requires that all citizens should be able to access public information. It creates a presumption of openness. The Archives Act goes alongside this. It's a later act, but it defines a record as information on any medium. Requires agencies and people performing public duties to ensure that their records remain in good order and that they are transferred to the archives at a legal point. It mandates that access must be unrestricted. Now, they have set up a governance framework which is evolving all the time, but basically both information technology and information management are coordinated by the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communications, really working through two departments, the Department of State Information Systems and the Department of Information Society Services. So they've got these two departments working in parallel. The State Information Systems coordinates the development of national information systems, of interoperability, security, IT infrastructure, and it works through something called the State Systems Authority to develop and implement day-to-day operations. Just to give you an example of the depth of work that they're doing, three of the key systems that are coordinated are an overarching administrative system of what's called the State Information System, and that tracks what databases are in use, what information systems, what data is being collected, who uses them, who uses this data. Then they have something which is really going to have an increasing impact in Europe called the data exchange layer, which is a secure central infrastructure that allows public institutions and private sector enterprises and citizens to securely access and exchange data. So it links up over 1,000 institutions and several hundred information systems, and it facilitates web services. And then resting on those other two is something called the Document Exchange Center, which is an infrastructure for transmitting documents, which could be letters, draft legislation, financial documents, through the XRO system. And this makes an interface between systems possible, easy, effective, and it links up systems, including document management systems, accounting systems, to transfer information. Citizens and private sector entrepreneurs can send and receive letters to any government state agency. And then the other key department within the ministry is the Department of Information Society Services. So here's where we get the partnership between the technology and the information management. And it sets policies for effective information services, records management, information governance, and it links digital records management to service provision with the aim of strengthening the information society and improving state policy formulation by ensuring that there is high quality information and data usage. It coordinates records and information policy across the government. In 2014, the Department and the National Archives issued guidelines on minimum requirements for Estonian public sector document and records management systems, and it based this on international information standards. And these guidelines support public service providers and agencies in ensuring that systems in information can be exchanged, there's interoperability. The National Archives also work with the department to prepare a standardized set of minimum metadata requirements based on an extensive study of metadata across countries that included the United Kingdom, Germany, Canada, and Norway. Because the view is that metadata is really fundamental to managing high-quality information service and exchanging records and data between organizations. There's also a records management board, which I think is very innovative and important, that links the records management officers across all ministries, and it also brings in the departments of the ministry, the National Archives, and they work together to define the direction for digital records management. Ultimately, they're hoping to bring the whole management of the information continuum or life cycle under one management, but that is in progress. The National Archives, which is part of a different ministry, the Ministry of Education and Science, is a key player in all this. And I have to say that the National Archives has made such an effort to integrate itself into the whole digital governance process. And it's very impressive to see how they have taken innovative steps to offer their involvement. And the Archives collaborates very well with the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communication in working on issues relating to the information society. The National Archives stays at the leading edge of professional development through its involvement in professional activities in Europe and internationally. And one that is particularly important, I think, is EARC, which is a research project funded by the European Union, which is bringing together the expertise of commercial system providers, research institutions, and national archives across Europe. They're coming up with a pan-European methodology for reducing risk of information loss. The Archives has a huge, extensive experience in digital information management, which allows it to work with the ministries and departments in whatever medium is necessary as part of a holistic system. Now, Estonia is in the process of a transition to a wider approach, which doesn't invalidate the importance of managing records as evidence, but it looks more holistically at information governance as a way of maximizing the use of information resources. So they are moving legally toward that as part of their digital IT strategy. And the Ministry of Economic Affairs is providing guidelines for managing the quality of information across different media, and the National Archives is already preparing guidelines for classifying and appraising information in relational database systems. Open data is a key part of all this, and Estonia is making an effort to really manage this as a resource, as part of its whole approach to managing information. Interesting that the Ministry of Justice and the Data Protection Agency are just studying the situation carefully to see that the data that is released still respects citizens' rights and protects them. So the challenges basically flow from the fact that when Estonia moved so quickly to introduce an ICT, a set of ICT innovations, they came in piecemeal as money was available. So there are many aspects of managing information interoperability, technical interoperability, semantic interoperability that weren't there from the beginning. And they're starting some legacy emissions, some legacy issues are emerging, but they are being well managed as they come up. Security algorithms, for instance, that have had to be changed recently. A lot of material which might have been transferred to the archives earlier, where the digital signatures could have been decrypted and we could have protected the integrity of the records. It didn't always happen, and so there are some issues in trying to deal with the long-term implications of the security algorithms changing. The standardized metadata requirements were not defined from the beginning, and that's slowed interoperability down, but they are tackling it. And the lack of explicit rules on quality record descriptions sometimes means that ministries post information about their holdings, but it's too general to be meaningful. So that is also changing. I think in conclusion, what we can say about Estonia's contribution, it is making an extremely rapid transition to the information society, and there are substantial benefits. But like other highly developed, technologically advanced countries, Estonia is really dealing with authenticity and integrity of the information and looking at it in new ways. And I think other countries, whether they're well-resourced or not so well-resourced, will have a lot to learn from Estonia's bold approach to the issues. If we turn now to Finland, where I think transparency and citizen participation are key aspects of what they're doing. In the national context, government transparency goes back a very long way. When Finland was part of the Swedish kingdom, Sweden was the first country in the world to have FOI, right to information, in place, and Finland, as early as 1859, opened the National Archives of the Finnish Senate, and they've gone on really with that tradition ever since. Finland moved very rapidly in the 1990s and transformed itself to a knowledge economy, and was successful in bringing its values of social solidarity and openness into a new environment. It first published a strategy for information society in 1995, and it's really continued to build on that, bringing the relationship between openness and information management into the equation at every stage. Finland joined the Open Government Partnership in 2013 to work with others toward the goals of citizen participation in open government. Finland, like Estonia, has a strong legal framework for managing public sector information. There are really a whole series of laws that emphasize this consistently, right from the Constitution down, where it's very clear that people have the right to government information unless there's an act that restricts it. The Archives Act followed. It defines what records are. It covers records across national and municipal government offices and across any area of society that carries out public duties. It protects the right of individuals to access information. The Act on Openness of Government Activities is really the Freedom of Information Act. And it is unusual in that it identifies requirements for good information management as part of its coverage. And it lays this down in a related decree. Another act, which is a little more recent, requires public authorities to plan and specify their information governance strategies. And this act is important because it gave coordination role to the Ministry of Finance. So the Ministry of Finance plays a very vital national role in steering information technology and interoperability. The aim is to facilitate evidence-based, customer-oriented public services and interoperable processes. And the ministry does issue public administration regulations both for information management and ICT management. The Ministry of Finance takes charge of the Open Data Program and is working to get a logical release of high-quality data as quickly as possible. It's in the early stages of building a national data exchange layer that will integrate information systems much as it happens in Estonia, And in fact, Estonia and Finland are cooperating on this very closely, and Estonia's X-Road will be used in Finland as part of the national service architecture, and then the two countries will work together to advance it. The National Archives comes under the Ministry of Education and Culture, and it's responsible for determining the values of records, the value of state records, and for making sure that they are preserved at a high quality for research and information services. Its responsibility for preserving the memory of the nation inevitably involves a key role in protecting and preserving digital information, where decisions at the point of creation of the information affect the ability to manage it. The archive staff, again, have very in-depth knowledge of records management, data management controls, and they, again, continue to upgrade their skills through regional and international professional activities. And there really is a very high level of professional coordination across the region, which is a good reason for some of their excellence. Quality control in Finland has long been achieved through registry systems that capture metadata in records, in registers. And this principle is still central to Finland's approach to managing digital records. Everything that comes into or goes out of a government agency passes through a registry office and is linked to administrative processes through metadata and in the electronic documents and records management systems. And this makes it possible to trace records required to meet RTI requests and to demonstrate accountability. The archives at present can set statutory has statutory authority for setting binding regulations for managing the records and metadata of public agencies. And this standard, in place since 2005, provides a standardized basis for access control and usability for bringing records into secure custody and making it possible to transfer records to from diverse systems. The archive since 2012 has been working on preserving database information. They discovered that of the many thousands of databases and registers across the public sector, not very much information was surviving. There are all sorts of challenges, but without consistent documentation of the systems, they've learned that data can be unclear, it can have little value. Fields and codes can change over time, and often the changes aren't documented. So really, Finnish Archives has been developing a more standardized approach to managing this issue. For Finland, I think the primary challenge now is to clarify management responsibility for all these phases of managing information. And what the Finnish government has decided is that there are three ministries involved: finance, education, where the archives is, and justice, which has responsibility for right to information, the legal aspects of making information open. So it's studying this issue, and it's working on resolving the overlaps and evolving a new model. They're working toward a coordinated law, and the archives requirements will disappear and become part of a new standard issued by the Ministry of Finance. And this will replace the archives standard. So in conclusion, again, Government of Finland views information management as a key aspect of digital governance. And its work on coming up with a new model for how you manage this is really something from which I think we can all learn. Turning finally to Norway, where I think the emphasis on information integrity and access to information is, again, very impressive, and we can learn a great deal from it. National context is just that this very, very open government has, for the last 3 decades, emphasized the need to introduce structures to manage information and make it easy for everyone who needs it to access it. Norway was one of the first countries to realize that you need to apply standards and structures if you're going to manage your information well. From 1984, they have worked toward a fixed set of model requirements. And this has enabled Norway to develop what I think, personally, is the most advanced approach to access to information of any country I've seen in the world. Norway was a founding member of the Open Government Partnership, and access to information is one of the areas it's stressing in its new OGP action plan. Just briefly, Norway's constitution, its Archives Act, and its record-keeping standard, along with the Freedom of Information Act, have all moved together. There's been a real integration of approach across those three. The Constitution, way back in 1814, has always emphasized commitment to openness. Everyone in the present Constitution has a right to access the documents of state and municipal administrations. National Archives Act, which goes back again to almost the same period as the Constitution, sets out the archive's responsibilities for overseeing the creation and management and preservation of records to support the needs of society. The archive's NOARC standard, which was developed from the 1980s, is a long-running effort to make sure that as we move toward digital systems, we recognize that they are producing records and that those records have to be managed. So NOARC, which is their standard model requirements for electronic record-keeping systems, was introduced in 1984 to support state accountability. And it built again on the concept of metadata management. The archives from the beginning has introduced regulations to support that act and that standard. So the standard links into the Norwegian Governance Act and the Freedom of Information Act, which also required that metadata be captured in a standard form. Freedom of Information Act goes a step further, and it requires that there should be a public register of incoming and outgoing documents. And this has really been the basis for their excellent approach to right to information. And NOARC has just marched right along with that in step, advancing gradually so that at first the documents were listed, well, they were managed, listed electronically from the beginning, but they gradually, the register of records, which was originally there to support the press and television, has gradually been opened up to the public. So with each successive new iteration of NOARC, there has been an increasingly effective means of opening these registers to the public. The latest NOARC standard makes the standards a lot easier to apply. And I want to talk about some of those challenges very briefly. But just want to mention briefly that the latest iteration of this National Electronic Records Register, which is now under the management of the Agency for Public Sector and ICT, is now moved to a whole new level, and it's part of the Government of Norway's core approach to openness. We saw in the latest figures I have are 2012, but by then there were 105 government agencies using it. They were processing about 2,000 information requests a month, and people were the press, citizens, businesses have been getting very high quality information through that open system. Norway's archives has one of the highest standards of trusted digital repository system. It doesn't yet give us access to many of the most recent records, partly because it's so difficult to extract them from the systems. But the very exciting thing in Norway is that instead of just resting where they are, they realized that they've got to move this whole system to a new level. And the National Archives is presently working on a whole new system which is tackling the need to streamline record transfers from the creating agencies into an intermediate archive, which will have a whole range of benefits. It'll make it possible to open the records much earlier. It will reduce the risk of lost records and data. There will be a higher standard of data integrity and a way of correcting errors early on, and most importantly, a way of sharing information. This new approach gives us the possibility of opening whole documents to citizens instead of just metadata about the documents, and this will be quite, I think, a world important step forward. Sweden, I should say, is working on a similar system, which will start to be introduced in 2016 to introduce cost savings and more effective public sector management. They're not looking at this stage of opening whole records, but they are looking at streamlining the way they extract the records and bring them into a central control. And so just in conclusion, I think that Norway gives us a window into the real benefits of structuring records and data and keeping these records accessible through time. The consistent application of system requirements, record requirements, has given us a 30-year traceable lineage of traceable information. So it's possible to compare policies, decisions, actions, expenditure over long periods of time. As Norway finds a new balance between defining requirements and the ability to use technology to streamline the way we manage them, I think we see some very exciting new contributions coming out. So, and Norway's systems are all open source. So I think that this is potentially a very valuable contribution to the open government process. Finally, my very brief overall conclusion is that digital governance and goals for openness really offer us unparalleled benefits, but achieving those benefits does require a stable and trustworthy evidence base, and that rests on a very effective legal and regulatory framework, which still is to be built in many places. I just think that the Nordic countries demonstrate to us the value of managing information as a resource, and the fact that we can achieve this as long as it's delivered in relation to national objectives for managing the digital environment effectively. And that's really what I have to say today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anne. That was a wonderful presentation, a great overview and synthesis of the main points of managing records, digital records in these three countries. There was a lot of information in there.
Yes.
And I just wanted to mention to our participants today that Anne's slides and the 3 case studies, Anne's slides will be available very shortly. The 3 case studies we expect will come out in the next couple, 3 weeks. Because there's rich information in there about some of the technical details, which of course we couldn't go into. I'd like now to go to the poll questions, I think is our next step. And so to our participants, we'd like to ask you if you would just please give us your feedback on these poll questions. We'd like to know more. So which of the following do you see as records in your environment? There is a lot of discussion about whether these particular objects are records or not. So in most of you said all of the above. And so yes, in many contexts, paper documents, email, databases, we're dealing with all of these. Okay, and we'll move on to the next question. So in which of the following areas would the lack of reliable digital information have consequences for citizens in your country context? Court justice, payroll control, land use management, all of the above. Everyone agrees that that there are enormous and wide consequences for having no reliable digital information. And so we definitely have to pay attention to these issues, which is why we presented to you today how the Nordic countries are dealing with this. And finally, does your national archives contribute to the management of digital e-government strategies in your country? And it's looking like in about half of the countries, yes. Many of you don't know whether they do or not. So that's a very interesting result as well. We'd like to be able to say that in 100% of the countries, the National Archives, that has traditionally been an organization concerned with managing records and information, would be making a contribution. So thank you very much for answering our poll questions. This gives us a lot more information about what the situation and context is in your own country. We'd like now to respond to your questions. There's been some wonderful exchanges in the chat while we've been presenting. Anne's been presenting. So Duncan Amole, sorry, apologies, Duncan, if I'm not pronouncing your surname correctly, but he's asking, what are the licensing, the licensing that the information that is made available in the Nordic countries? And I believe that they do use Creative Commons licensing. I'm not sure, Anne, if you remember which particular license, but if you don't off the top, that information will be available in the case studies.
But I think the point is they make it freely available. For instance, in Estonia, it's available, it's there, it's free for reuse. All of the countries, it's free reuse.
Yeah, and I think that is the main point. And I think the other takeaway for me from your studies is that really there isn't any point in having right to information laws, open data initiatives, and other transparency initiatives if the information that would be made available under those initiatives isn't accessible and you can't trust it. I mean, that's the main point. Yeah. So, really to make all of these transparency initiatives successful, you need to be thinking about how are you going to manage the records, the underlying records, information, data. There was a question that came from Adam Cowling, and Adam was asking, well, what's the difference between the right to information, right to records, right to data? And you do find in the different laws in different jurisdictions, some of the laws will mention information, some will say right to records, some to data. The main point is that what you want is free and open access to the whatever information, records, data you need to hold governments to account, to actually participate fully, as a citizen in the governance in your country, and also for the economic benefit that come from using open government data to, as we see in many of the open government and open data initiatives, develop new applications that provide services to citizens and so on. So that's, whether we call it one type of thing in one law, the underlying message is, openness of all of these types of forms of recorded communication, which are increasingly in digital form. So hopefully that answers your question as well, Duncan, about the economic development in countries too. I know that Anne didn't look particularly at how publicly available data has been used in the Nordic countries. That was outside the scope of the study that she did. But again, the point is really that, isn't it, Anne, that if they're going to be used for those purposes, you want the data to be trustworthy, because you can't build a business on data that isn't accessible or trustworthy.
Yes, two things. That and that so much, they're very aware that so much data that's being created is not surviving. It's just being lost. And it's not possible to access it or preserve it if it's not being managed effectively. So over time, we lose a huge resource that could give us patterns and, the opportunity to observe trends effectively. And so for research, that's a huge, huge bonus. I haven't studied or looked at specifically what are the successful open data initiatives, but I think the main point for me is that they're absolutely committed to this, but they're also absolutely committed to making that data so reliable that it can be used for policy decisions and that it will survive.
Yeah, I think that's a key point. Yeah. And one of the ways, this is to, Abdelaziz had asked a question early on about interoperability and also about metadata. And it comes out very clearly in your studies that both of those aspects of how these countries are dealing with their digital records, interoperability and metadata, are key to
and that they must work together.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So could you talk a little bit more about how do they achieve interoperability? And what is metadata for those who may not have a clear idea of what metadata is, and why is it so important to digital preservation and managing digital records?
Metadata really gives us the ability to track who created the information, when they created it, why, and as long as we can capture that it gives us the whole context. If we can capture that in relation to the content, now we've got something which has got legal validity. And I think, for instance, in Norway, we see that the latest standard does not support interoperability as it needs to. Mm-hmm. This is why they want to get control streamlined and move it outside from the agencies so that they don't have to build new applications to make systems interoperable each time, but that they can exchange information easily between systems. And the more it's structured and controlled, the easier that is to achieve.
So in Finland, for example, they have a standard, I think you mentioned, and that they has allowed them to tag their records.
Yes, and they have their data markup language, which is shared between Norway and Finland. And Sweden. They do collaborate a lot. But I think the new standard that will come out of the Ministry of Finance, although the Archives has done so much work, I think it brings it into a wider arena where it can be related directly to interoperability, security, maximum benefits of ICT.
Right, yeah.
Finland uses the European standard MOREC. Finland has its own, Norway has its own, but they all follow the same principles that we need to define the metadata, the structures, and the processes.
Right.
And the responsibilities.
Okay. And I just wanted to finish with one last question because I know we're running short of time and there's so much we could discuss, but you mentioned the standards that they have within the countries, but you also mentioned that they refer out to some international standards.
Yes,
maybe you could mention
and I saw
which of those.
A question about that. Mm-hmm. Obviously there is a European standard. There are international standard organization standards. Estonia actually produces and will produce in the case study a list of the standards that it uses and the standards that it taps into from the wider set of standards. I think one of the impressive things that isn't always capitalized is that the information profession has really worked very, very hard to come up with standards that can be applied internationally. They're not required that every country use the exact same standards, but I think in every case the principles have been shared and integrated. With the Finland standard, for instance, they, from the beginning, drew very heavily on the European standard. NOARC actually came out before any of these other standards, but it has kept track and kept pace with European standards and made sure that they are compatible.
Right. There's so much more we could talk about. The technical details will be in the case studies, which we will be releasing. And I just wanted to say there was a question that came in online asking, is there support? Is there funding available? And I would just say to those listening that the bank is providing support to client countries in the area of helping and assisting them to to build the digital infrastructure that's needed to ensure long-term preservation of digital records and sustainability, to support the right to information, to support open data initiatives, and so on. So that funding and technical assistance is out there. The International Records Management Trust and other organizations have wonderful resources, and you've developed over the many years that you've worked on these issues, fabulous resources that are all openly available and free to download. So I invite those listening to follow up and visiting the International Records Management Trust website. So thank you to everyone who's joined us today. If you do have other questions, please feel free to send those questions to us. We'd be happy to respond to your further questions. We realize that this is just the tip of the iceberg of what we could share with you and of the questions that you likely have on how to meet this challenge. So thank you very much to Anne, who has generously shared her knowledge with us today, to those who provided knowledge from the Nordic countries to support these the development of these case studies, to all of you. And I'd just like to remind you that we will continue with our open discussion forum on transparency and information management again next week. We will have David Banasar from Article 19 discussing the post-2015 strategic development goals and giving us an update on that. So please do continue to join us. And we look forward to seeing you soon. So goodbye, everyone. Thank you for joining us.